Hi everyone. Today I'm here with Chantal Constable, who's the head of UK and Ireland for CGI Retail Banking. Chantal, thanks very much for chatting with me today. Really appreciate it.
Really good to be here today, Chris. Looking forward to it.
So I thought I'd ask a little bit about how CGI have seen through the COVID pandemic, and particularly what we've seen over the last 12 months. And we're just really at the anniversary of it now, and it'd be good to hear just a little bit about the story around, what you've kind of seen, really.
Well, it's been an unprecedented year, and I think there's a lot to talk around what has been challenging for both our customers and indeed for us in delivery. But I also think when we reflect on the last year, we're looking at like what we can keep, what's worked, what we're going to be keeping moving forward. And I think what's been interesting has been the need to pivot. So never have we seen our customers and indeed us as a business need to pivot as much as we've seen in the last year. And I think when we think about sort of debt management, collections and recoveries business, the way that we've had to respond to the pandemic has almost created quarterly cliff edges. Right. Every 12 weeks, there's another set of challenges, whether it be, localized lockdowns or indeed government forbearance advice. We've needed to pivot. And I think that's relied on, flexibility and change of individuals, but also how you can deliver in different ways. And I think over the last year, if you'd have said to me we'd do a global implementation of one of our SaaS pieces of IP completely remotely with teams in the US, India and the UK, no one co-located for a year, and for that to be a perfectly acceptable delivery model, you'd have, that's quite a statement to have made. Whereas now we've found ways of working we've previously almost told ourselves wouldn't have been possible. Right. And now that the pandemic has forced us to work in different ways and prove what is possible. And I think we shouldn't lose that as we go forward into what the next phase looks like, as we can start to co-locate. There's some cracking kind of ways of working, delivery tools, etc., that we shouldn't just throw away as being seen as less valuable than face-to-face. And I think that's been an interesting journey.
The flexibility of like how things have had to change throughout the year. I mean, it's almost like every month's sort of been different. We started off with large volumes and then sort of like lower volumes. Now people are sort of thinking about what happens towards the end of the end of lockdown, and what kind of technology do we need to have? How do we leverage digital transformation? Those kind of things. And so it seems like it's really sort of had to have that sort of complete sort of like almost like agile working or flexibility throughout the whole of the year. And did you find that was similar by market? So you just mentioned international. Was it similar by market, or do you see same themes in the same markets, or did it change across different markets where CGI work? I mean, obviously you're a global company.
Yeah, we're a global company, and I think it has it's been interesting as we go around the globe. And you're on these medium, this medium, and in the UK, we have predominantly worked from home. In other parts and other geographies, you've seen colleagues actually co-located in an office, and that is quite a shock to see that on a screen. You're used to being just one-on-one, and seeing colleagues together on screens was interesting. So that, I think, highlighted how different geographies have had different levels of restrictions. But I think generally it has meant, that our offshore delivery centres, that home working is a very, very new way of working in some regions, and it's been adopted wholeheartedly and been successful. So I think I haven't seen the geographic changes. What it has made me very aware of is, even differences in the UK, colleagues and clients who are in England versus Ireland versus Wales versus Scotland, and trying to keep track of what restrictions are in place and what, people's work, home life, clients, what's acceptable policies, etc. That's been quite hard, I think, to be cognizant of all the time, because I think personally we've been quite in our own boxes. What restrictions am I living under? Yeah. And actually being conscious of that more globally is harder, I think, in this kind of home working environment.
And were you able to pick up sort of almost like different ideas and different approaches from different geographies? So we all have slightly different, we've all gone through this together. I mean, really globally, it's one of the first times to sort of have one of these things globally. But do you find there's sort of different ideas from different areas in terms of like how to look at home working, how to do distributed working, those kind of things? I mean, were the nuances that could be almost like picked up and best practice picked up and transported?
I think it's different engagement models, like what
Mm,
works for people. I think that whole ability to stay connected and how you borrow ideas from either clients or you see other teams working. I think it's made us feel more globally,
mm,
more global as an organisation and indeed as citizens. I
mm,
think it's been a great leveller
yeah.
across the piece. Whereas we talk about different cultural styles of working, different ways of working, quite often that bled into social events, conferences, the way things were structured. All of that has been levelled by these platforms. So you're on Teams in the US, you're on Teams in the UK. It's starting to look and feel the same. So I think it's been a great leveller. I think some of the more informal ways of working have been interesting that I've started to see on conferences. So
Mm,
breakout rooms. I've heard of some organisations randomly selecting colleagues to set up a Teams chat with every 15
mm,
minutes of a certain hour in a day, so that you can recreate the kind of coffee and the water cooler chat.
yeah.
Which is, how do you kind of create those connections that would have happened in a more kind of reactive, opportunistic way, because you don't have that opportunity at the moment. Everything is planned. How do you create some level of random behaviour? That's been interesting to see both on clients and with other geographies, and how they're trying to create that interaction that's a little bit less structured.
And how much do you think that the new ways of working is going to stay? I mean, so sort of like, as we sort of come out of this, as it sort of gradually fades, at least anyway, how much of it's going to stay? Which pieces do you think are going to stay versus not? I mean, there's been great advantages, just as you talked about, but there's also some things that people are definitely missing around the social side of things, or the meeting people face to face, and the subtler side of things as well.
There's the subtler side of things, and I think creativity. So when you think of what we do in business, solution design, the whole
Mm,
concept of whiteboarding,
mm,
that physical interactivity you have that doesn't necessarily come across in the screen. I think that will be something we do want to get back to,
yeah,
and just physical presence as well. I
yeah,
think what we are considering at CGI, and definitely for my business, is how does the new almost meeting etiquette work? Because this platform works when everyone is on their own, and
okay,
that it's a level playing field and everyone's on a screen. When we've seen meetings where you've got 4 or 5 members in a room and 3 or 4 people dialing in, how do you manage the raising a hand, the noise in the room as opposed to the platform? And
yeah,
how do you make that work in an office environment where we're now not on conference calls, we're on screens? How are you going to manage all of the surrounding noise, the moving
mm,
backgrounds? That's going to be interesting. We're starting to think that through, and that's going to translate itself into office infrastructure, I think, as
yeah.
to how do we keep this platform, how do we keep these agile ways of working, but when we start to co-locate together as well.
Yeah,
That, I think, is going to be a challenge.
it's almost like a new digital divide that will come up in terms of the people in the office
Mm,
versus not, and like how do you sort of guard against that in a way. I was on another
I
call the
do.
other day about how historically these things probably don't just end; they fizzle out. And I think that's probably what we're going
Mm.
to see is like, so we're waiting for this big aha, well, we're back to where it
Well, it's like we're
was.
waiting for the street party, aren't we? Of
Yeah,
of when it's announced it's over, and I
yeah,
think, because it started with such a bang, and I think
yeah,
that's the thing, is it started with such a bang. People almost think that you want it to end with a bang,
yeah, yeah, and
and actually,
it'll probably end with a fizzle.
it'll probably end with a fizzle, or yeah, no, or we'll find this was the first of the pandemics, right?
Yeah, yeah.
This is the way we're going to have to live our lives in the future. So
Do you think working from home with the team, people work harder when they're working from home? They're more productive, maybe. Is hard is probably the wrong word, actually. Do you think people are more productive than working from home than when they're in the office?
I think they're more productive from when they're working from home, because there's more available hours.
Mm,
Yeah, because the commute has just disappeared and been consumed into the working
yeah,
day. Um, and I think, that, they're not popping out for lunch, you're not meeting anyone for lunch. It's rare anyone's actually taking their hour's lunch break.
yeah,
So I think that the problem is the relentlessness of it.
yeah,
And what will be interesting when we go forward is an expectation of availability, because at the moment we expect our members and our client, we expect everyone to be working from home and available because you're sat
yeah,
there, right?
yeah,
That concept of having to walk between meetings or travel time and not being available on a medium, like being back on a phone, not broadcasting yourself as you're walking between,
Yeah.
locations, for example, or in a car. They're things that we've got used to not having to worry about.
Yeah.
And I think in our own professional psyche, we're going to need to start remembering they are the activities we will start to do, and
Yeah.
that will eat into the working day.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. It was almost like when you go out to see clients and you drive to a client or you're on the train, the ability to be able to turn around the next proposal or turn around the suite of emails, or I mean, particularly if you're driving, I mean, that time isn't there. Whereas now
No.
you can do it and you can turn things around really quickly, and just whether people have got used to that level of productivity or not, or maybe it's just other things.
It's productivity, but it's quite tactical,
Mm,
because what I found is we've lost thinking time.
yeah,
When do we sit and plan? The days are absolutely filled relentlessly with back-to-back calls,
yeah,
document production, but actually that ability to stop and think long term, and it's almost the pandemic's given us that kind of ability to just play the ball in front of us,
yeah,
think
yeah,
quite tactically. That's all we've needed to do. So that muscle memory of time to think, because I don't know if you're like me when you're driving. When
yeah.
I drive, it's when I think, it's when I sing to the radio, it's when I think. When on the train, it was just that moment. The trees are passing by and you're thinking, like, what's the day hold?
That's what we should
What
do.
should we be doing?
Yeah,
And actually, we don't have that anymore. The commute's the flight of stairs. You're grabbing a cup of tea, you've dropped the kids off from school, bang, you're straight onto the
yeah.
computer. And actually, we've got to relearn to think that thinking time's really useful, and putting it back in the diary, thinking.
Digital's been a big push throughout the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. And I suppose in digitalization and then digital transformation is, both, all of which have been themes, and it seems like there's been a lot of investment, of that. I mean, what have you seen around that in terms of like investment from the banking community in particular? And then, how do we think about digitalization versus digital transformation and making sure they're actually using it not to just do more of the same quicker, but actually like transform the businesses? How have you been thinking about that?
So I think this goes back to this need to pivot. So I think we had a lot of organisations and a lot of in the banking community, I think especially around collections, where there'd been an underinvestment potentially overall in platforms, etc. And I think that need to pivot and the need to use digital, especially to self-serve, came early. So we saw a lot of things like I&E tooling, customer self-serve being spun up quite quickly. Now the question is that now for the long term? Or rather, is there a point at which a digital reaction, which is basically what we've had over the last year, then turns into digital transformation?
Yeah.
So, we've been working with a number of partners, OutSystems, Netcall, low-code application providers, where you can spin up something quickly. The difference is, how do you take something that was tactical and turn it into something strategic? And I think that's where the digital transformation piece comes in.
Yeah.
And where we're seeing developments in the UK, such as around open banking, actually now the customer self-serve, the ability to look at how you use APIs, what role does open banking and citizens' access to their own financial data through API standards, how do you then start to translate that into how do I help my customers from a financial support perspective? So there have been a couple of, I think, nifty tactical digital front end pieces that could really start to have some more strategic legs as we go forward into the next year. And I think about things like request to pay. Yeah. So we've been working very closely with a partner in a fintech called Aldo. And ultimately, request to pay has been a fantastic way for neighbours, for example, to pay each other. Through a simple request to pay, payment request via a text or indeed via a link. Now, request to pay operates over the faster payments rails. So that was a really easy way for a contactless payment to be made between two individuals. When you start to think about call centre staff having to work at home, there's some PCI DSS compliance challenges about taking card payments when you're working in this environment. And actually, payment overlay services using open banking APIs cuts all of that out. So there's an innovation in saving of the credit card fees. There's an innovation in operational workflow without the requirement for PCI DSS compliance. So something that has been used quite tactically between neighbours, something that's been invested in from an open banking perspective and used in some proof of concepts, I think you can really start to see some use cases structurally, especially around open banking, that can start to fold into digital transformation.
Yeah. So it's almost like we've had tactical digitalization and workarounds, but now there's still a lot of work to do really around the transformation piece itself and actually really understanding it and embedding it.
Yeah, and how much of those solutions were accepted to be a solution for right now and accept to almost throwaway technology?
Yeah.
How many other pieces provide you those nuggets for what the art of the possible with regards to more strategic transformation?
So you very much talk a bit about being a reaction through COVID, and there was quite a lot of investment that was available to do these workarounds and sort of put in digital self-serve programs, those kind of things. As we sort of move through the arc of the the last year, it's almost like it feels like people are now starting to think about well what comes next. And are you seeing that there's going to be the investment profile is going to change from being collections back end to being more front end in terms of getting out there and lending again? I mean, do you think, is there going to be a subtle change? Because it's been great in collections to have some, the wind in our sails to a certain extent with investment and investment funding available. But is that going to change going forward? I mean,
I think it's been interesting. The investment has been, I think, a lot in looking at the business model. So operational capacity from the outset was obviously a massive concern. And as we see, these cliff edges, as I mentioned, when you think about requests for payment holidays coming to an end at the end of this month, all payment holidays ceasing by the end of July. There's a lot more to come operationally, and with regards to collection volumes that have got to be considered. So I think, first off, there was sort of tactical digital front-end investment and indeed investment around operating models. So what I have seen is a large move with operating models over the last year to take collections which may have sit, partially in credit risk, partially in some of the product silos. You've seen centres of excellence in collections being created. So I think business models, digital front end has been, the first wave of the response. But as you know, that can only get you so far. I think there's going to be starting to look at underlying structurally the operational processes, maybe RPA in that mix, machine learning, the potential for data and pre-arrears. I think it's completely untapped. And I think pre-arrears will become massively more important because we're seeing people in the last year go into collections that may never have been in financial difficulty for their entire adult lives. How they are treated now, and that trust with their building society, their mortgage provider, their current account provider, that trust they've built up from being a good financial citizen, then when in their moment of need, if they're not treated the right way, how they're treated in this pandemic is how they will remember being treated from a brand awareness perspective. So getting that right and how that then structurally starts to build into the architecture of the operations is definitely how we need to start thinking over the next year. So you've gone from a react to a art of the possible to being able to plan forward. And I think pre-arrears will be massively a part of that, as well as the sort of legacy challenges. Because you'll have got as far as you can get with digital tactically until you start to, need
the
transformation. To look at the underlying challenge.
And what about on the lending side, on the upfront on the lending side? I mean, do you think there's pent up demand for banks to get going? In terms of like getting back into the market and increased lending, or do you think they're still in a wait and see mode?
I think they're in a wait and see mode. I think you've got challenges around, how some of the digital transformation budgets I've seen get slashed, how they're expected to do more with less because that funding has been used for payment holidays. So I think I can see a wait and see approach to how the measures domestically are eased and what that means for spending before we start to see any major changes in products coming to market. I think there's still a bit of a sleeping giant operationally that I'm seeing clients looking and modelling and starting to plan for in the back end of this year. Bounce back loans. I mean, that again, very difficult to understand if you're a bank how you're expected to collect on those, what the government backed element of that looks like. Is there going to be a central utility for operating them and a BPO? Is there not? There's a lot of uncertainty still, which means I think there's going to be a level of caution in financial services for a time to come.
I mean, it certainly feels from a financial difficulty point of view, or even bounce back loan from a corporate point of view, that we're far from out of the woods yet. I mean, so there's a lot of talk around this sort of like tsunami of debt or a large wave of debt that's expected to come through, and we were expecting to come through last year, then it started this year. Now it feels like it's going to be a little bit later. I mean, what are your feelings around? I mean, is it there? When do you think it will come through, and how we've got to think about it really?
I think the challenge is we thought it was going to be a sprint, and now it's turned into a marathon.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a different level of planning and of preparedness for a marathon as opposed to a sprint. Yeah. We've been used to being in react mode, and I think when we thought everything was coming to an end in March, bounce back loans were due for payment, all the mortgage holidays, that we thought this cliff edge was going to come. But now it feels like it's going to be a slow and steady drip. We will still probably end up in not a great place, but that's going to go on for longer and maybe deeper than a lot of people imagined. Yeah. And I think that that's a change in mindset, a change in planning, that's spanning multiple budget years as opposed to a massive dip within one fiscal. And I think that, when we think about the end of September, the end of furlough, we can see the kind of the measures and the potential for those measures as they are relieved to have impact stretching well into 2022, 2023. Yeah. And I think that level of planning is going to affect how people view digital transformation, because now you're talking about an impact from COVID that spans the life cycle of most digital transformations, 3 years.
Yeah.
So it's becoming a program in its own right, rather than a reaction.
So it's almost like we think of it not as like a single event where where there's going to have a huge amount of volume coming through, but spread over time, and it helps operationally, but it means we've got to think about our processes differently.
Definitely, and I think going back to what I mentioned before around people coming into financial difficulty for the first time in their adult lives, I think pre-arrears and customer experience are becoming a massive element of how collections and recoveries is being transformed and seen as financial support for customers.
Yeah.
So
a portion of the population is also going to be vulnerable as well. So how should we think about that? I mean, so we've, obviously it's been a health impact that's happened. There's been huge pressure on the health services. And we've had, people who have either got sick or they might have been ill and not been able to get treatment as well. I mean, how do we think about that in sort of conjunction with the financial difficulties piece as well?
So identifying vulnerability has become increasingly hard before the pandemic. I think the pandemic in its own right has created a whole nother category of vulnerability. And I think we're seeing people, go in and out of vulnerability potentially far more frequently because of what's happened with the pandemic. I think from that perspective, there will be increased scrutiny on banks and their ability to, demonstrate how they are identifying vulnerability. And I think that's where we're talking about, machine learning, data and analytics, even behavioural analytics to help identify some of the unseen vulnerabilities. I think mental health has become, a massive focus for a nation as opposed to just an industry. And the ability to identify mental health is harder. So I think, there's going to be more pressure to look at new ways, to look at technology, but also to think deeper around how we identify vulnerability and accept that those people who were vulnerable at the start of the pandemic have had increasing pressures and delays, from a health perspective in treatment, etc. That means they would be vulnerable for longer than you may well have expected pre-pandemic.
We chatted a little bit about data and the fact that a lot of the new systems being put in place have been digital. There's a huge amount of data that's now being generated, right? Which can be useful. But one of the other impacts on data has been sort of like the pandemic itself has almost like changed some of the historical data we would currently use. So I think about credit scoring as an example, or credit reporting, and we're used to it. We've been quite stable, relatively stable over many years, and then over the last year, everything's kind of changed. We've got different interactions with with their payment providers, different interactions with the banking. People have been on furlough, they've been on payment holidays, etc., and all of that's sort of written in the record. How do we think about changing data and then using that data for then customer outcomes and customer treatment?
Well, I think it's behavioural analytics, and then I think those behavioural analytics and data being used to be able to help individuals rather than look at it being an indication of future performance, actually saying we can see these data attributes and we know that people with these data attributes, but based on the last year, within a certain timescale, are going to need this level of help. And I think it's therefore turning it around, and rather than data being seen as creepy, data being used for financial institutions to become helpful to citizens. And really saying that, many people are living hand to mouth. They don't know what the future holds for them. We have data that shows people in that situation 6 months ago, this is what happened to them. So we can start to be proactive and help people to say, we can see you cancelling direct debits, we can see all those normal behaviours, but actually this is the support we think you need now, because we know the data is telling us this is where you could be in 3 months' time. So let's get ahead of the curve and help people in financial difficulty and vulnerability, rather than it being used from a credit scoring perspective or an after the event perspective. It can be used more proactively.
Yeah, so you're thinking of it much more almost like on a trigger basis. So these things have happened, or these combinations of triggers have happened. So that prompts a conversations, which is actually quite easy to understand, rather than the more sort of like the modeling kind of approach.
No, yeah, that's exactly what I agree. And I think it can enable banks to have just a different conversation with their customers and actually be seen as a services provider rather than just a financial services provider.
I do kind of feel on the modelling piece that unless the models change, and particularly unless scoring models, etc., they still use the same things they always used. They will either over predict or they'll under predict, and I don't know sort of if that's an opportunity for people, or it could be a risk for people as well going forward as well. Or are you hearing that people have sort of started to factor that in?
I think it's been so volatile over the last year. It's going to take a while for that to embed in what is seen as normal with regards to the curve that we've seen over the last 12 months. I think when we start to think about lending and lending decisions and how quick we get back to the liquidity in the market, I can see lenders wanting to see a lot more data before they start making those decisions. And I think that's where we could see some caution from a data perspective, and needing another sort of 6 to 8 months under our data belt to be able to be comfortable about the types of decisions we make.
Yeah, and do you think there's a role in companies like yourselves and CGI actually gathering more data, or do you think we got the data we actually need?
I think you need to have the use cases to know what it is you want to do, because data in itself, there's a difference between data and intelligence. It's what you do with the data. So the danger is we kind of consume ourselves. We've all heard of the data lake projects. We see customers aggregate the data, but what are you going to do with it? Because that's where intelligence comes in. So I think actually subsets, proof of values, proof of concepts with data is we've got to be really, really intelligent about the use cases. Otherwise, it is data for data's sake. And I think that's where intelligent automation and the use of data to streamline processes, the use of data to be helpful to citizens, the use of data to create new products that you can see are going to serve a market, rather than data for data's sake. It's the creepy versus helpful. How much data do you want someone to have on you before they start offering you something that's useful, not something that's a little bit odd?
It also sounds like, you can just have too much data. You've got to know what you're going to do with it as well, otherwise you're just like drowning, and you can get lost in it. And you've got to have a little bit of focus around it, which I suppose is where the data science and sort of the smarts really around it comes in.
No, indeed, and that's where I think it's about focusing on the data that can make the difference. So the data for the use cases that can make the difference, and actually starting to be far more proactive with data as opposed to reactive with data.
From your team point of view, how have you found that, with the remote working, how have your team found remote working? And how do you think that's then going to evolve?
So I think from a team perspective, adapted really well to remote working, but we're now at a point where we want to be together. And I think it is interesting. Never did I think we'd be scheduling, Zoom beers on a Thursday or a Friday night. It's most unusual. But I also think there's a level of anxiety as to how quickly we're going to all be together, in what context, in what environments. and what that starts to look like, and how, as a leadership team, you make it okay for
Yeah.
people to go back at the right level of need for what works for them, and that we're sensitive to, geographic distances, geographic travel, and staying close to what our clients are doing. So I think socially, there's quite a lot to be done to understand how we communicate getting back together.
Yeah.
Because everyone's personal circumstances have been so different throughout this pandemic. And I think, the personal and the work life has blurred. People will have, concerns about, their own health, the health of their families, etc. And so it's making sure that we, meet people at their level of need when it comes to that social interaction. But as far as the team's concerned, they've been fantastic. But it's now got to a point where it's gone on long enough, I think, and we want to start getting back together where we can see each other once again.
I mean, some people are definitely being desperate to get back, and some people are definitely more cautious. And it's almost like there's quite a big spread, isn't it? I mean, it was almost like hidden before in the normal reactions, but actually it's just people's lives, isn't it?
It is, and I think, at the first, we were talking on the 29th of March. Yeah, so for today, the rule of 6 is back. And you think fantastic, and there's part of you that wants to get out there and just enjoy it for what it is. But then if someone said to me, right, jump on the Central line tomorrow, there is that kind of rising anxiety of thinking, rubbing up against people I don't even know when I haven't been able to see my nearest and dearest for a year, is a bit of an odd thing to wrestle with. So I think, the socialites in us just want to get out and see people. I think when the reality hits, you're finding yourself in a bit of a conflict. I think when we think about going back to normal.
And how are you thinking about it in terms of an interaction with clients remotely versus on site? I mean, being on site just adds a huge amount of value in terms of those personal interactions. But being remote allows you to do things like this. I mean, you can pick up the phone and talk to someone pretty much anywhere in the world instantly.
This goes back to what we can't miss. Yeah, what we can't lose from the pandemic and the ways of working. So, absolutely, we want to be with our clients, right? So we're really just mirroring what our clients are doing, and many have no steadfast plans to be back in the office. And at this point, CGI, we're still exploring our options. But with regards to what we can't lose, it's been an eye opener in the value chain of what we see of client service provider interactions. The face-to-face meeting was always king. If you were going to do a workshop, it had to be face-to-face. Yeah? And in the way that financial services are structured nowadays, that could mean 5 regional offices having to co-locate, probably in London. Overnight travel, diary arrangements, the expense incurred, and usually 2 to 3 month lead time to get everyone's diaries together. Now, with this medium, 2 weeks, a couple of hour sessions planning, 4 solid hours of work, and suddenly we're able to fast track delivery, fast track client conversations, because we're not dependent on co-location. We can't lose that. We will lose agility if we go back to the way we were. That's why we've got to go forward with a hybrid model, I think.
I think it's also interesting to just take workshops as an example. I mean, there's so much investment in a workshop for you to be there all day and for everyone to be there all day.
Exactly.
And really, usually by the time you get to the end of the day, everyone's usually quite exhausted because you've been talking all day. And you can contrast that with maybe doing a couple of hours or 3 hours worth of, an online workshop spread over even a couple of days, and just whether that keeps people more fresh. I don't know if you found that, and you actually get more out of it in some ways. Can do.
You do, because you can't do this medium for more than a couple of hours before you really start to get fatigued. But what we've also done is, it's been interesting being the recipient of training actually during the pandemic, and how training works on these platforms. Breakout rooms, brilliant to be able to change the dynamic and contribute rather than just receive a broadcast. The other pieces are leaving the window open, so people going away, grabbing a coffee, and you still get the 1 or 2 people join early, start having a chat about how it's going. You're still getting that informality, which is sometimes missed in the workshop environment. It's the coffee chats often that spark the conversation more so than the main session. But actually, we've found ways of making this work and making it productive, and making the time either side more productive. And I think that's the piece. It's the planning, it's the time either side that's more productive, not just the sessions themselves.
So lastly, how do you sort of see the next sort of like 12 months sort of really panning out? And we talk a bit about what's happened, but what do you think sort of see on the horizon, as we go forward, and particularly from a tech point of view, or how we've got to start thinking about our businesses going forward?
So I think there are a number of things we will be able to do. I think we'll be able to plan in a longer term horizon.
Mm,
We've been very much in reactive mode,
mm,
and I think we will start to be able to see a longer term planning horizon, both for our own businesses, our clients, and ways of working together. I think the concept about going back will be lost, and a hybrid model of going forward will start to be explored,
yeah.
and how we can use technology alongside physical interaction. So I think it will be a fascinating social experiment, if nothing else, as to how we professionally conduct ourselves to enable inclusive conversation across
Mm,
multiple channels as well as face to face, and how we start to engage not just with locations, but more remotely. I think we will be surprised when we re-enter the city as to how many people were no longer located there.
yeah.
So you asked me the question before, saying, what you're doing, your physical location with clients. We will have many clients who, when we go back, their offices in London will no longer exist. They've chosen to go regional. They've moved
Mm,
their workforce to home working. So it will be an exciting year where we start to see a digital hybridization of how we work,
mm,
and that will be unprecedented. Yeah, and for people in technology, it's such a fascinating and exciting time to be
yeah.
working.
Yeah.
I think it's, we've got to look at the positives, and I think the next year is going to be a fascinating time to be working in financial services and in technology.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's been fascinating over the last 12 months, and I think you're right. I think it's just there's
Mm.
still a load more change still to come through, and I think it would be equally as interesting as we sort of like move into much more sort of like permanent structures almost. So, well, Chantal, thanks very much for making the time and chatting to me. I really, really appreciate it, and I really appreciate your insights, and it's been great. So, thanks very much.
No, thanks, Chris, and really, really enjoyed our conversation. And here's to what's hopefully going to be a positive and exciting year forward.
Fantastic.